presentation, which will be our work to do on impedance, electrochemical impedance spectroscopy for the characterization of electrochemical systems, and more precisely, which will be electrochemical converters, PMC, and storage devices on the example of supercapacitors. So this is a work we do with I'm applied and our research group at the Lantern. So my topic will be divided in the following 5 parts or parts. We'll start with a brief introduction to our research activities of our research group at the Lantern. Then to be sure that everybody is on the same level to correctly has the skills correctly follow the presentation, give a brief introduction to electrochemical impedance spectroscopy. Then there will be one part which will be dedicated to the modeling of electrochemical storage devices on the example of supercapacitors, which will be of particular interest, I guess, for the data. And a 4th part will be on the modeling of electrochemical generators, always apply to impedance spectroscopy, so on the example of fuel cells, and to finish with some concluding remarks. So for those who attend the summer school, it will be, will recognize some parts. I changed a little bit, so means the first focus will be on supercapacitors, because there will be some new, and as I realized that Nadia, I don't know if she's there, perhaps she will be standing there to also make some more slides and more details on our analysis on fields aging. So just to start, this is our research group of Orlando. So we are the Hydrogen Electrochemical Systems Research Group. It's the Mainka is a laboratory specialized on theoretical and applied mechanics and energies, situated located in Nancy. We are divided in 3 main research departments, which concern energy transfer, fluid media physics, and energy carriers, and all transverse research groups specialized on MRI techniques for engineering with Ford interaction, with a strong interaction with our research group. So the Hydrogen Electrochemical Research Group makes part of the energy carriers department, which concerns research on the 3 energy carriers, which are heat, electric energy, management of electric energy, and hydrogen. So we are composed of now 4 permanent researchers, since the 9 permanent researchers, and we are happy to welcome this year. So our junior professor, Giuseppe Stangis, next year, next year 9, and of about 12 PhD postdocs and internship researchers all assembled over here on the floor. So our research activities focus mainly on membrane electrode assemblies and their components of fuel cell and more recently other electrochemical systems. With this, we're just situated between the researchers and developers of material science, means to develop and characterize the individual materials of membranes, cathodes, dipole, and so on. And on the other side, the researchers, they are charged with the electrical engineering, so it's more your specialty here. So they are concerning to the systems for industrial and commercial application. But this means we're always our research activities are in strong interaction with both research field and as well with some interaction with scientists. More precisely, our principal applications are historically pan fuel cells since the beginning of our research activity at the Mainka between 2000 and 2006, and the characterization of the polymer membranes, priority by NMR and NRI techniques. Since then, we opened our research application to all different kinds of electrochemical systems, which refer firstly supercapacitors, and more precisely direct hybridization with fuel cells, so without power devices. And then now, since then, for all different kinds of electrochemical systems, which are mostly based on hydrogen, and they're sitting all the chain of valorization and hydrogen, starting from the production of hydrogen by PEM electrolyzers, the storage and compression, and more especially compression, especially electrochemical compression and absorption, desorption, and now on other kind of different kind of electrochemical converters in fuel cells or hybrid fuel cells and ionic exchange fuel cells, and as well storage devices like redox flow batteries, and as well more recently like fabrication of electrodes and characterization of catalysts, and recently as well as some application to Joule-Thomson coils. What we're interested here in this presentation will be more precisely PEM fuel cells and supercapacitors. In regarding the electrochemical system we're interested in, all our research has the same scientific approach. It means we're interested to make the link between the macroscopic phenomena, means the performance and the impedance of the electrochemical systems, here shown as an example of a PEM fuel cell, and the microscopic phenomena which underlying the macroscopic response inside different components, means, and more precisely, heat, charge, and mass transfer phenomena, the water management, and as well the identification and following of degradation phenomena. In order to make the link between those both line scales, we need on the one hand well-adapted measurement techniques that we develop as well in our group, and an appropriate description of the physical, chemical processes and the geometries inside the different components, means develop as well make conjoint modeling to our experimental techniques, which are with the objective to identify, to interpret our experimental data, means our models has to respond to two requirements. Sorry, means they have on one hand be sufficiently complex in order to take into account the main physical phenomena that underlie microscopic response, and on the other hand, they have to be sufficiently simple in order to be applicable to in situ characterization. So our main research, and so if you want to divide our research activity in main topics, we can identify three. On the one hand, we have ex situ analysis. In order, they concern priority the membrane and the electrodes and catalysts, in order to analyze the structure and transport water properties. So our main experimental techniques are MRI and MRI and infrared spectroscopy, for example. On the other hand, we have in situ analysis, which are performed by instrumental sets, and the objective is to follow the electrical performance and durability. And the third application, it's on a minor extent, is sometimes we develop as well innovative architectures of systems, which are based on our findings on the other line scales, mean by situ in situ analysis. This one is majority done with the interaction with our collaborators or inside the laboratory with the working group of electric energy management, such as energy that you know here at the council, the industrial collaborators. The main issues of all our analyses are the analysis is improvement of the performance and durability of these systems. One particularity of our research group is the conception and as well the construction of our instruments themselves that are used for the measuring of the characteristics of our electrochemical systems. So we have, on the one hand, segmented cells, which are used for the measurement of the local performances and working conditions for mostly durability studies. Means mostly we have a segmented cathodic flow-feed plate. Means where we have where the current collector plate is segmented in individual current collectors, so electrical isolated current collectors, and as well in our last generation of the cells, we have local reference hydrogen electrodes, which allow us to measure as well the local current profile and as well local electrode potentials, as well as cathode side is shown here, and at the other side. So here we have an example to see the current profile of current and electrode potential profile with time during startup and shutdown cycles. These are done, we have some linear cells which are used for more fundamental studies, means where we have linear flow feed plates, but as well we use some segmented cells with more standard geometries, which are more appropriate for the collaborations with industrial partners, for example. We have as well instrumented single sets of small size that are more rarely used to test new materials, if it is for membranes, catalysts, or electrodes. We have then all our experimental studies have been analyzed using different in situ characterization techniques. On the one hand, we have steady state methods like polarization curves, means voltage against current, hydrogen permeation current, and measurements which are useful to analyze the states of the membrane. And what I said before, we can measure the electrode potentials locally and locally at the cathode and anode side. And then on the other hand, we have transient methods like cyclic voltammetry, which is used to identify the electrochemical surface area of our electrodes, and then last the electrochemical impedance spectroscopy, which is useful to identify electrochemical parameters which underlie different forms of our system and which allows us to identify different voltage driver sources. What we are interested in this talk is more precise studies than the electrochemical impedance. Okay. With this, so as I'm not sure what is your knowledge about electrochemical impedance spectroscopy, I would like to give a brief introduction to this measurement techniques. We show that everybody can follow. In a general way, the electrochemical impedance technique that is used to analyze the performance of electrochemical systems such as fuel cells and supercapacitors. The method consists in the application of a times perturbation of small amplitude for a known frequency to a system and to measure the associated response and response. So, for example, if you apply current perturbation, you measure voltage perturbation. Did it for a given frequency, and it allows you to identify the transfer function means the impedance, which is a complex number depending on the frequency. This means the main advantage of this technique is that it allows you to consider separately the frequency domain, which separates different phenomena that have different characteristic time scales, and to analyze them separately in the frequency domain. According to the control variable, you have two different modes of EIS. One we call potential static mode, when you apply voltage variation and you have a current perturbation, and you call it galvan static mode if you apply current variation and you have the associated voltage perturbation. In our case, we apply galvan static mode because it's more easy to for fuel cells, potential static mode for supercapacitors. In order to perform EIS, you have some requirements to respect this. First, you need stable operating conditions for sure. You have to be sure that you have a linearity between the control signal and your response signal. And then, in order to be sure in order to be sure that the substance what you measure, you have to show there's some causality between the response measured and the perturbation you apply. Okay, the impedance is a complex number that you can represent in two different modes. Means one in terms of the amplitude and the phase shift between the stimulus and the response. And this would be the representation would be the Bolton plot that you do not have, so I won't show you here, or you can choose a representation that Cartesian form means you represent the negative imaginary part versus the real part for the frequency, which is called, it's shown here, it's called the Nicholas plot. It's more convenient for direct analysis, so that's what we primarily use for our analyzing. That's what I will use here in the presentation. Why the imaginary part is because it's for convenience in order to be able to represent a Nicholas plot in positive form. Here you see an example. For example, you see an example of Nicholas plot for our resistance and capacity series connection, which consists so in the frequency is a vertical line with the resistance. It's a purely real impedance element. Means you have vertical line intersects the real axis at the value of this resistance, and you have a vertical line which converts to infinity for zero, for its frequency of zero, here typically for a capacity. If you have a parallel connection of a capacity and a resistor, then you will observe half loop, half circle in the Nicholas plot with an intercept at low frequencies corresponding to your resistance and an intercept at zero, and this is at high frequency, and the highest point of this half loop corresponds to 1 over RC. So this shows you directly why this representation is convenient, because directly from the shape of your Nicholas plot, you can deduce a first estimation of your parameters. Okay, there are different interpretation methods for the signal measure. The three main methods you find in the literature are shown here. So we have on one hand physical models they are derived from the transport equation at the microscope scale. So means or they are necessarily linked to the physics of the systems. So they will necessarily yield you information about the phenomena governing the output sigma. The tricky point is they can very fast become very complex, and you will have some analytic expressions only for single components or very simple systems. Another point technique is the distribution of realization time, meaning you apply a small perturbation of your system and you measure the relaxation after the perturbation, and to separate the relaxation according to different relaxation time. So means you can interpret the relaxation in terms of the timescale distribution of the individual processes. Means, for example, mass transfer processes, diffusion phenomena are very slow, so they will occur at very high relaxation, low relaxation, high relaxation times, and for example, charge transfer phenomena are very fast, so they will occur at very low relaxation time. And then there's a third method, main method is it's called equivalent electrical circuits, means to represent the system, an electrochemical system, by an assembly of different electrical components like resistors, capacitors, and inductances, which can be, just say, it's just a representation in sense on this circuit. And the objective of these circuits is, principal objective is to reproduce your impedance spectrum that you measure. And in order to have some physical sense of your circuit, because depending on the circuit, the number of elements you connect, you can be sure that you will be able to fit and reproduce all kinds of spectra. Tricky point is, in order that it makes sense, to have that the individual electrical components have to be linked to your physical, to the physics of your system. That's a tricky point. And this will be for the EDCs, electrical circuits, is the approach we use to analyze our experimental data. And in order to be sure that we have link between the individual electrical components and physical system, we have to make our objective is to make our models sufficiently complex again in order to take account the main physical contributions of the output response, and sufficiently simple, so the most simple as possible, in order to have some reliable parameter estimation and to be sure to link our components of the system. So my objective here of this talk is to give you some information about the physics behind the different circuits and to show you the application. So we'll skip all kinds of model derivations. If you're interested in, we can discuss after the presentation and can give you lecture about this. So the idea is here to have really some use of this EDC's application. Okay, the first application here will be what we do on modeling of electrical storage devices in supercapacitors. So for those not familiar, supercapacitors are similar storage devices like batteries. Big difference between both is they have supercapacitors have a much lower energy quantity storage capacity, but as well a much higher kinetics, means very much lower charging and discharging times. So therefore, they are primarily used for energy recovery applications, backup power supplies, or for voltage stabilization, means they are used for hybridization. This fields are for direct or indirect. So the part here will be divided into parts, and we'll give you some generalities of supercapacitors, introduce you the usual equivalent electrical circuit models, and then show you an application or characterization of some hybrid fiber-shaped supercapacitors that we did in, they are shown here, the very original geometry that we, with the work we did with the collaboration with the research group at the Moscow State University that developed these blasts. Okay, a supercapacitor. What is a supercapacitor? Is an improved capacitor. The most simple case means it's composed of two electrodes separated by an electrical separator. The big difference with classical direct capacitors that use plain electrodes, metal electrodes, and a solid dielectric. So in the classical ways here, charges are stored at the interface between this plain electrode and the solid dielectric. Is that supercapacitors use porous electrodes, and this allows and the liquid separated electrolyte means charge storage is done inside the porous space at the interface between the active material, this electric conducting phase, and the electrolyte, which stores the positive charges, and in a purely capacitive way. So it's primarily it's the case of capacitive charge storage. It's electrical double layer capacitors, which stored on the form of electrical double layer, and this means you have significantly higher charge storage area surface than in a classical capacitor, and a much lower charge separation distance, so order of nanometer, and the ideal compared to the order of millimeter in a classical capacitor means you have significantly higher specific capacitances of supercapacitors in the order of 6 orders of magnitude higher, more or less, than classical capacitors. You have different kinds of supercapacitors according to the type of charge storage. So you call it electrical double layer capacitor if charge storage is done in a purely capacitive manner in this electrical double layer inside the pore space, what I just mentioned before. And we call it pseudocapacitor if you have additional pseudocapacitive charge storage, which can be done under the form of underpotential deposition, redox reactions, just like in batteries, for example, paradigmatic electrochemical reactions, or by ion intercalation inside the porous space. So the devices we are interested in are, we have additional charge storage, redox reactions, and intercalation. The characterization of supercapacitors can be done in the time domain by analyzing the charging, discharging curves here, which are here when applying a constant current, or in frequency domain by using electrochemical pigment spectroscopy, and this here typical Nichols plot of ideality. In both cases, the interpretation is done by EECs, but just note it's not the same EECs when you analyze the data in the time domain and in the frequency domain. That is one challenge as well when it's done for supercapacitor characterization that identified circuits can be used for analyzing, can be used for both analyzing domains. That's out of the scope of this presentation. So here I just will focus on analyzers and the EECs used for analysis of electrochemical impedance spectroscopy data. Okay, starting with the typical EECs that you can find in the literature and that use. So in the first case for analyzing electrostatic charge storage without self-discharge, case of EDLCs. So it's shown here again the scheme about this. So what I said, supercapacitors, the main characteristic is that they have porous electrodes and charge source is then inside the pore space. So the most classical model is the so-called transmission line model, was introduced first time by Levy, where you represent your electrodes by a representation of, imagine electrodes composed of cylindrical pores with the lines identical to the electrode thickness. Half of the pore is composed of the solid electron conducting phase, the active material. Other half is composed of the electrolyte phase, and you suppose that in the case of electrical double-layer charge source, the charge source is done at the interface between both phases, and means so that you represent your your supercapacitor by a distribution of individual capacitances that are distributed according to pole lengths, and they're separated by resistances, ion conducting resistance, and electron conduct resistances. Note that in conventional supercapacitors, the electron resistance is normally negligible compared to the ion conducting resistance, therefore it's neglected in a general way. You complete this transmission line by a series resistance that's primarily connected, linked to the current collector and different interface resistance. Okay, that's our circuit. Here you see if you solve this circle, so in the frequency domain, you will end up to this expression. Means this expression impedance depends on different parameters that's shown here in the circuit and the frequency. Here you see the typical associated Nyquist plot. It is characterized by a vertical line at low frequencies corresponding to the capacity charge storage. Here I have a low frequency line, and you have at the highest frequency a 45-degree slope with an intercept at the series intercept to the real axis and series resistance. And now this 45-degree slope, if you it's associated with the ion conduction inside along the pore space. Means this is if you observe in the spectrum 45-degree slope, it's directly linked to the volumetric character of your electrodes. Means this, you have thick electrical ion conduction inside the electrode thickness. Okay, so that's ideal supercapacitor without any self-discharge. Reality is other. You always have some self-discharge phenomena of the device that can be duly done to the redistribution of the charges inside the pore space. And how to model it is simply by connecting our leakage resistance, cardiac resistance, in parallel to your capacitances in your circuit. This means you have an additional parameter in your impedance expression, and according to what is the impact of your leakage resistance is, the lower the leakage resistance means for more self-charge, this will end up in a deviation of your low frequency line from the vertical line. And if you have really high leakage, you will end up with a small loop at low frequencies. So we call it the node that's as this parallel connection of the leakage resistance in parallel to the capacities is the typical way how to take into account Faraday reactions. We call it the Faraday transmission line model. And you can show that if this leakage resistance tends to infinity, means negligible leakage, we will end up again with the vertical line at low frequencies, which is the case of idle EDLCs. So means that this Faraday TLM can be used as a general circuit for all kinds of EDLCs with and without self-discharge. And that we tested by characterizing different kinds of EDLCs. So what you see here on the left side, this is a spectrum measured, this time in blood points, on EDLC with aqueous electrolytes. As shown here, this was a device that was developed by some colleagues of us at EMN in London, so the framework of a research project on supercapacitor hybridization of supercapacitors and PMCs. So, and here on the right side, you see a spectrum measured on a very classic super EDLC supercapacitor using organic electrolyte from that is commercially available. In both cases, you see the typical shape of EDLC supercapacitors, and you see in red our fitting curves obtained with our Faraday EDC. You see a very nice correspondence to the experimental data. Here on the upper part and the lower part, you see the identified parameters. And if you have a look up that our capacitances and series resistance correspond more or less to so here we didn't know the capacitance, you knew it more or less. So our parameters corresponded much well to what we measured in the time domain. And you see that as we have a vertical line, lower frequencies means very low, or the absence of self-discharge corresponds to a very high leakage resistance. So that as well is an agreement with our expectation. Means we have this approves the validity of our Faraday TLM to our devices. Okay, that's the case of EDLCs. If you have no pseudocapacitors, means additional pseudocapacitor charge stores under the form of electrochemical charge stores, so it means redox reactions. And you have another type of circuit that's typically used, it's the Randall circuit. I will introduce this circuit more in detail on the part of fuel cell characterization. Just note that a typical way to model Faraday reactions, redox reactions, is to do it by a parallel connection of a capacitance and a charge transfer resistance. Charge transfer resistance represents kinetics of your redox reaction. The capacity means capacity of your pore space to store charges. And in order to take into account ion diffusion, you connect a diffusion impedance normally, so ion diffusion inside the electrode pores. You connect the diffusion impedance in series to charge transfer resistance. And the typical diffusion, most classic diffusion impedance is Waterworth diffusion, is pure diffusion. That's all we need at the moment. It depends on the characteristics, diffusion time and the diffusion resistance. Okay, these are our parameters. So this is the electrochemical charge storage contribution. Again, you find series resistance. And what I said, that even for pseudocapacitors, you always have a contribution of pure capacity charge storage that can be modeled by a double layer capacitance. And if you want, again, you can take into account leakage, and by connecting a leakage resistant parallel to the double layer capacitance. Here on the right side, you see the typical Nichols plot of these kinds of supercapacitor. It is characterized by a half loop at intermediate to high frequencies that corresponds to your electrochemical charge storage, and a vertical line or steep line at lowest frequencies, again, according to the leakage, the lower the leakage resistance, the more pronounced variation of the low frequency line from vertical line. Okay, that's the circuit you use. I just know the Randall circuit is the crucial point of the hypothesis. It supposes that your charge storage is done at an interface between the electrolyte and the other. Means it is typically associated to interfacial thin electrons. So usually it's a contradiction to supercapacitors as a porous spaces, so you have thick electrodes. So this was the major point we will come to this later. Another thing is that for those that are convenient with EIS, very often you find what we call constant phase elements instead of real capacitances. Constant phase elements, they introduce an exponent alpha, it is the CPE, so we have the CPE parameters, a complex capacitance, and your exponent alpha. This exponent alpha will result in a deviation. So if you have your exponent alpha in your pseudo capacitor on your Randall circuit, this will result in a depressed symmetric half loop. And if you have it in CDL, so in the double layer component, this will result in the deviation of your low frequency line from vertical line. In a practical part, this is used to better fit the spectrum. But as well, this has a physical interpretation, was very important for us. And the CPE allows us to take into account ion diffusion, or characterize the impact of the pore space shown here on your ion diffusion. Means if alpha is equal to 1, the constant phase element corresponds to pure capacitance, means your pore space has no impact at all on the fusion of your ions. If alpha is higher than 1, means you are faster than the fusion rate, taking into account convection that you do not have in supercapacitors. And now what is the interesting case is if alpha is situated between 0 and 1, means you can measure the impact of the pore space on your ion diffusion, means that the lower alpha means that the pore size is lower than the free part of your ions, means you have really sub diffusion big impact on diffusion. Okay, so that would be used as well. And while now you have all your skills to be able to follow our interpretations of the results we measure on the fiber hybrid supercapacitor that were developed by our colleagues at the North Carolina State University. And they developed some supercapacitors with an original geometry and under the form of fibers, very thin fibers. So the objective of these fibers were they're developed in order to develop connected closets. So you see here a sand image of the fibers, and they use as well original materials, means graphene oxide and MXene. MXene is a new family of transition metal oxides. I won't go into the details of this. It's more chemics and really out of the scope of my competences. What I'm interested in is that it's a very particular layer structure at the molecular scale, means you have charged layers of your transition metal oxides, and which are charged at the surface, means you have a additional charge storage contribution under the form of ion intercalation between the different flakes. It's a little bit similar to charge storage into clay. It's at the origin of swelling of clay when it's humid, and the shrinkage of clay when it's very dry. So it's the same physical process. Ion calculation just says it's a form of capacitive charge storage. So when we model it, we include it in the EDL, actually AA charge storage, just like classical capacitive charge storage. So these are our, this is active material. The electrolyte was a classical aqueous polymer, is sulfuric acid, and they used as well some stainless steel current collectors. So if you see these devices are, one electrode is composed of two current collectors, which assemble four used graphene and NXene fibers, and they twist it together to form these fiber supercapacitors. What we tested, so our objective was, so our colleagues, they developed these devices, and they were interested in our skills to have a model that allows to interpret the experimental data with the parameters linked to the physics in order to have more performant and durable devices. So what we tested were different circuits. So we had, what we had to take into account was two contributions to charge storage, one electrochemical, because graphene oxide, MXene, primarily MXene, in contact with sulfuric acid is subjected to to redox reactions, and you will have as well charge storage. So we have electrochemical charge storage, means we tested two different kinds of circuits for electrochemical charge storage. The classical Randall circuit that I just introduced before, but Randall circuit, what I said, is based on the hypothesis of interfacial electrodes. And even more, if you have fibers, long fibers, with thick electrodes. So what we developed, we just said as well, it's a kind of modified TLM that we inspired by what we used for PMFC characterization, meaning it is a transmission line model which is composed of individual Randall circuits that are distributed along the fiber length and which are separated by what we call internal resistance, electric resistance. Up to the moment, I let it open, it is linked to ion transport or electron transport. And then we have the additional capacitive, so ideal charge storage means at this stage we include the capacitive and ion intercalation charge storage in this element, and this one was represented by a constant AA constant phase element that's connected in series to the electrochemical circuit. Note that we tested as well the influence of self-discharge by connecting a leakage resistance in parallel to this AA FCP, and finally we connected series resistance. Series resistance taking into account so the resistance of our current collectors and the different interfacial resistances. So two models which have respectively 8 or 9 or 9 or 10 parameters. Okay, here you see the experimental spectrum measured on a fiber supercapacitive of a length of 15 centimeters. Here you see the overall spectrum measured between 1 milliards, so here at the left side, the low frequency limit, and 1 megahertz on the right side. And here you see a zoom to the high frequencies. So, and you see in red our fitting curve obtained with the modified TLM, and in blue with the Randall's modified Randall's EEC. So what you see is that experimental spectrum is characterized now to see at the highest frequencies by a straight line. I hope you can see it here, which is, I remember you, associated to ion or to charge transfer according to the inside the electrode volume or fiber length. At intermediate frequency, the spectrum is characterized by a depressed cycle. So since the core space has an impact on ion fusion, and at the lower frequency, you have a steep line associated with purely capacitive EDLC charge, EDL charge storage. So what you see is that at highest frequencies, the random circuit is unable to take this into account. And this is logic because I remember the random circuit is based on an interfacial electrode, means cannot take into account this 45 degree. By definition, cannot take into account this 45 degree slope. Whereas our modified TRM yields a satisfying fit quality. Concerning our deepest semi-circle at intermediate frequencies associated with electrochemical charge stores, once again, we have better fitting quality of our TLM rather than with the random circuit. Means that seems we conclude from this one that the TLM circuit is more appropriate to model this charge store contribution for these devices. And at the lowest frequency, we have a satisfying and identical fitting quality for both circuits, which logic because electrical double layer charge storage is modeled in the same way for both circuits. And just note here that we have satisfying fit quality without the need of connecting a self-discharge resistance, means that self-discharge seems to be negligible for these devices, at least in the analyzed frequency domain. Okay, this week we validated our model for our devices. So for the next one, for this slide, I skipped the Reynolds, the fitting curves obtained with Reynolds circuit, just use the modified TNM. And here you see the dots, the experimental data that were measured for our fibers with a varying lengths between 5 centimeters in blue and until 15 centimeters here in green. This what you see is with increasing fiber lengths, we have the 45 degree slope at the highest frequencies is more pronounced. Logic, long fibers, long electrodes, thick electrodes. And as I remember you, the 45 degree slope is associated with charge transport according to electrode length, so volumetric character. And for very short fibers, we have an almost perfect semi-cycle corresponding to a Reynolds type circuit, means interfacial electrode. But what we see is that independently, our fiber length and the shape of the spectrum, we obtain, satisfying fitting curves with our modified TNM, which again validates our model for these types, use of our model for the types of supercapacitors. And here, what we see, I just showing you them because we have 10 parameters. So I skipped all the parameters, not really useful for what I want to show you here. What I just showed you here is the internal resistance. Yeah, charge transport, associated transfer and transfer. We identified from our fitting curves for the different fibers, parameters from 5 to 15 centimeters, and it increases, which is logic because it's associated with charge transport according to fiber lengths. And this logic, when you increase fiber lengths, you have a higher resistance. So it seems to be in agreement with physics behind.
I just received a question. You want to answer to them now or in the end?
As you asked it now, we interrupted.
Okay. So there was a small question on slide 26 by Sutnya Valda, who asks, what would be suggestion for a better fit model when EIS curve at lower frequency is less than 45 degree?
Okay, it's the highest frequency, less than 45 degree here.
Yeah, you can ask. We hear you perfectly, Sutnya, so you can just ask the question yourself.
Thank you so much. Sorry for bothering you midway, but I have a quick question. What happens if our slope is less than 45? I really don't understand the physical meaning behind it, because that slope usually shows the diffusion process, even in fuel cells and batteries. I work specifically with batteries. So in lithium batteries, that curve shows the diffusion taking place at very slow rate. That's why at lower frequencies we use it to plot that physical phenomenon. But when I use my when I use my curve, I'm not able to fit it at 45 degrees Celsius. So my instinct was to use the CP instead of a Wabi element, but it is still not giving a good result. So would you suggest using resistance in series or in parallel with it?
Okay, I hope I understood it well. So uniform right, we're sure we are talking about. So you mean about 45 degrees?
Yes, for my curve, I'm getting less than 45 slope.
That's what we observed as well. So that's a tricky point we're working about. So literature you find two possible explanations. If you have inductive contributions on inductance, I guess you see. So here I show you only data that stops here in positive part. If you have inductance, if you go to higher frequency, you will see only inductive behavior. Yes? I guess you observed it as well. Inductive behavior can be due to your connection. And if you have additional conductive behavior, as this will result here in an inductive loop, this can result in a decrease or deviation of your slope here, 45 degrees, that you have lower inclination than 45 degrees slope. So it means there's a contribution that comes from your connection, electrical connection.
Okay, so
It's a possibility.
Purely inductive interference from this circuit.
Exactly. This could be artifact from the measuring connection. Now, as well, a real physical reason means that you have a very high impact of your pore space on ion conduction. This as well is like the same stuff like the alpha exponent in your CPE that will result in a depressed circle if you have impact of the pore space from your, so can be done from your CPE. The lower your alpha exponent, the higher the impact of your pore space on ion conduction, the more depressed is your semicircle, and the lower the slope as well. So have to both possible. Until now, here as well, we have a small decrease, yes. And if you want it, I guess here in our case, here we have 45 degrees. And if you see here, I start here and have some points that are out of the fitting group. Actually, we have some inductive behavior. If I skipped here on this graphic, the points that we measured at higher frequencies, where you would observe deviation for 45 degrees slope and inductive behavior. Just know, I tested. We all on our group. But what we would obtain when connecting an additional inductance. So this was very low inductance, and as well connecting the inductance or not. Having an inductance, we would have a better fitting quality. but we would identify the same other, the same values for the other parameters. Means physically, for me, connection of inductance only will result in a better fitting curve, in the same conclusions that I showed you here. And again, I just remember you is the more you have parameters, the more, the higher is the probability of correlations between the parameters. And as in order to be sure or the most, that to have more, it is you will lower the correlation between keep the correlation between parameters the lowest as possible. Therefore, I skipped it. Just answer to your question. I guess it's a mix.
Think so, yes.
Okay. If not, it says some other questions, more, can send me an email or discuss after. Okay. Okay, last slide of our inside capacitors. I remember for this internal resistance, because for these devices, this was the most interesting parameter, because I remember in classical supercapacitors, this internal resistance is linked to ion confusion of the electrolyte. Normally, the electric resistance is negligible. Okay, but here's the fact. We show you here again our identified internal resistance from the fitting curves for the times. So for it remains more or less constant because it's a characteristic parameter. And we compare this value identified from the fitting curves with the electrical resistance of the active material, means of our of the mixture of reduced graphene oxide and anything that our colleagues measured independently by potential static measurements. And if you see, we are very close to the electric resistance or resistance linked to electron conduction of inside the material, rather than to the electrolyte resistance. So means for this pseudo-capacitive, or for this fiber-shaped pseudo-capacitive fiber-shaped supercapacitors, this internal resistance seems to be linked rather to electron conduction than to ion conduction. And we tested this as well on the fitting of pure capacitive fiber-shaped supercapacitors, where the active material is pure copper. I did not show you the fitting data. Conclusions are the same as what I showed you before. So here you have the devices, and just know that here we have pure electrical double layer charge storage, so without contribution, or very slow contribution still. And here again, the internal resistance we identified was very close to electric resistance of this carbon. So again, it seems that this fiber-shaped geometry, is on the origin of this internal resistance. So this was the major finding of our model. And for us, certification was that we resulted in having a model that was useful for interpretation and useful for our colleagues for the interpretation of the experimental data, and hopefully for useful for pursuing and continuing the development of these devices. Okay. Oh, I want to stop here on modeling supercapacitors. Their objective was to give you an overview of what is possible to do with on our side for the interpretation of EIS data in storage devices. The next part, the rest of this talk will be dedicated to electrochemical generators, means polymer electric membrane fuel cells. As you gave me 2 hours, I will insist 2 hours. Yes. But we can stop where you want to. If you want to, just maybe ask. Again, there you will find you will find some same information I gave during the science school. And then, as Nadia is now here, we're interested in our aging analysis. I needed some more data on our aging analysis and future aging. So we have to talk about it. Okay. So see, I guess everybody's familiar with more or less with fuel cells, so I won't go into detail. This is a fuel cell, PEM fuel cell, storage devices with where the core, the heart of this device is the membrane electrode assembly, means an assembly of 2 electrodes separated physically and electrically by a membrane. Means the membrane impedes gases and electrodes to cross directly from the anode to the cathode, and only allows ion conduction from the anode to the cathode. Means the overall global oxidation reaction of hydrogen is separated into hot reactions. The membrane electrode assembly is actually composed of different materials. Just to say that an electrode again is a porous material composed of different materials, electron conducting phase, mostly carbon, catalyst, mostly platinum-based catalyst, and ion conducting phase, so it's mostly the same ionomer as the electrolyte membrane, and we need some pores in order to allow gases to access the active sites. So this is only the electrode, again, the membrane is in the electrolyte, and you have the membrane electrode assembly is covered on both sides by gas diffusion layers. That's the objective. Gas diffusion layers are used to homogenize the gaseous flow to the electrodes, and both completed by flow-free plates, which ensure the gas supply and the collection. So these different materials have all different requirements for optimum different geometry, and then the requirements for optimum operation. And there, the phenomenon, the microscopic transport phenomena occurring in these materials underlie is what we call the polarization curve. It means the evolution of the fields of voltage as a function of the current density, which will have a certain that's shown here. So at the lowest currents, just it's primarily governed by electrochemical reaction kinetics. Here at the intermediate currents is primarily governed by ionic conduction due to the membrane hydraulic, and at the highest currents will be governed by mass transport, mostly oxygen transport phenomena. And what we observe is with time, we'll have some aging phenomena. So the performance will decrease. We are interested in when we use our characterization to identify the different physical phenomena which underlie shape of the polarization curve and its evolution. Okay, coming to directly to impedance spectroscopy. When we measure the impedance of a fuel cell, we will apply current perturbation at a given imposed current and measure the corresponding response in terms of voltage perturbation. Ideally, the spectrum will be composed of 3 loops. At the highest frequency, very small loop is the anode, because the hydrogen oxidation reaction is very fast compared to the oxygen reduction reaction. At intermediate frequencies is associated with the cathode reaction kinetics, so the reduction of oxygen. And at very low frequencies, we will have a third loop, it's associated with mass transport, so majority oxygen. Primarily when you feed your fuel cell with air instead of oxygen, so oxygen diffusion very low compared to the reaction kinetics. So this will appear highly low frequencies. So that's theory. Reality, most parts of reality spectrum will be composed of two more or less mixed groups. So normally the anodes reaction kinetics are negligible compared to cathode reaction kinetics, and the anode will continually be neglected or overwhelmed by the cathodic loop, and the separation between cathodic and mass transport loop is more or less pronounced. Another point is that the wobble shape of the spectrum will correspond to the different materials you use and as well to the operating conditions. Means, for example, here at the left side, you see a spectrum that we measured with a commercially available media, means they have very thin electrodes. And when you have very thin electrodes, means you have very small contribution to ion conduction. So the electrode thickness will play at the highest frequencies. So we will have more or less our 90-degree vertical intercept with the real axis, the highest frequencies. Whereas if you have thick electrodes, that we can see when we have self-assembled homemade media, which are hot pressed using gas diffusion electrodes pressed on a membrane, homemade. It's for sure it's less perfect in commercially available medias. So here we have a spectrum characterized by a 45-degree slope at the highest frequency, so volumetric character, just remember the slide before. And as well, our spectrum will be dependent on the operating conditions. Means, for example, if you have different relative humidity, means humidification of your membrane, polymer membrane, and needs water to correctly transport you positive ions from the anode to the cathode. Means the higher your relative humidity, means the lower the membrane resistance, means you will your spectrum, the higher the humidity, the lower is the value of the resistance, the real intercept of your spectrum with the real axis. And will as well depend on your oxygen supply. So oxygen will supply your mass transfer is a very slow process. So oxygen supply will play on the spectrum at low frequencies. The lower the oxygen supply, the highest pronounced the half loop at the lowest frequency, and the higher the oxygen supply. Okay, means your circuit that will be adapted to interpret the spectrum depends and on the media and on the operating conditions. So that's really one have to find that circuit. Okay, let's start with a typical circuit used for interpretation of PAN spectra, starting with the blocked electrode. Means if you supply your fuel cell with hydrogen and nitrogen, means the current generation in this configuration, your fuel cell corresponds to a supercapacitor more or less. The supercapacitor in this case, you see directly here a spectrum that's measured for a blocked electrode and fuel cell characterized by a steep line, more or less vertical steep line, below the frequencies associated with electrical double charge storage at the interface pore space between the carbon and the electrolyte, and a 45-degree line at the highest frequencies associated with, this case here, really ion conduction inside your ionomer phase, inside your agglomerates of electrodes through the electrode phase. And in this case, the circuit, this corresponds to the shape, is the same as the classical supercapacitors, the theorem that was derived by Dilly. See? Now, just to remind you, here's the transition between supercapacitors and fuel cells. Okay, but normally you use your fuel cells not to store charges, but to convert hydrogen and oxygen into water and to produce electricity. So the typical configuration is an operation with hydrogen and normally air. The typical spectrum we measured is shown here, 2 half loops. Remember, low frequency oxygen diffusion, intermediate frequency charge transfer kinetics during the oxygen reduction reaction inside cathode, and the highest frequency intersect with the real axis associated majorly to ion conduction through the ion. And the typical circuit it used is the Reynolds circuit. So here the Reynolds circuit is based on different hypotheses, means most crucial hypothesis, you represent your electrode like an interface between the membrane and your GD MOOCs, really interface, charge storage, and form for electrical double layer, 2 positive and negative charges. You suppose as well that you are in hyperthermal isobaric conditions, and that the cathode is the place of water production, means that all energy drops due to electron conduction and conduction GDL and the acetate neglected. You suppose that you have a constant oxygen concentration at the interface between GDL and the profile plates. You have pure, you have oxygen transportation purely by diffusion, by binary diffusion or convection. And the cathode is limiting electrode, means the Reynolds circuit corresponds only to the cathode reactions. Cathode kinetics means anode is completely connected. So here again, what you see is you find your Reynolds circuit. So when we call the Reynolds circuit is the parallel connection between the double layer capacitance, the charge transfer resistance, and the Barlow element diffusion impedance. That's the cathode. By what we call the high frequency resistance. The high frequency resistance is actually majorly dominated by ion conduction in membrane and faces the common different interface resistances at between different materials. The charge transfer resistance is linked to the, what I said, the reaction kinetics can be expressed to the slope, law, and the cell current. So what you can do, so here for just on an application, what you can do with this. So for example, you can fit with this Reynolds circuit your global spectrum. You did analyze your local spectrum that you measure with this cell locally from the inlet of your air along the flow rate until the outlet, and identify here your high frequency resistance, associated membrane and ion conduction, and do also along your fuel cell and compare to the global spectrum and application, and go into detail of more interpretation to say what you can do on analyzing your electrokinetics. Okay, the Reynolds circuit, again, call it, is associated with thin electrodes. But if you have now, so thin electrodes means it's typical, it's a vertical line at the intercept with the highest frequency with the real axis. But if you have now here a spectrum, see, for thick electrodes, which is characterized by 45 degrees. So around the surface here is a fitting curve obtained in orange is not able to take this into account. So here we need a model that takes into account the electrode thickness. And this will can be done again using a transmission line model. And here the transmission line model we use developed, adapted. So when we use sometimes we should use this as well, is a modified TLM consisting of individual Reynolds circuits distributed along the electrode thickness and separated here by dielectric conduction resistance. In this case of fuels, it's short and conduction. So again, here we see the expression characterized by the charge resistance and about element. And if you see here in blue, when we fit our experimental spectrum with this modified TLM, we have satisfying fit quality. And what we show, what we analyze is that we can show mathematically if for a neglecting ionic resistance, your TLM corresponds to a rounded circuit. We will obtain the same expression. So this one here will result in this expression is directly the expression of our rounded circuit. So means that your modified TLM can be used for generalized circuit for analyzing all kinds of fuel cells, no matter if you have thick or thin electrodes. And then we tested as well. Here's a spectrum measure. So here's a spectrum measured on a commercially near the thin electrodes. Here you see the fitting curves of your rounded model and of your TLM. And we see we have identical fitting curves. So this validates the validity and possibility of our modified TLM. To give you another example of what you can do for analyzing spectra is focus on oxygen diffusion impedance, means low frequencies. So if you can have oxygen diffusion, physically, oxygen diffusion occurs indeed in 3 different stages. First two stages is a gaseous, primarily gaseous oxygen diffusion through the pores of the GDL, then through the pores of the active layer, or smaller pores, until accessing the active sites. You have finally diffusion through the small ionomer layer covering the active sites. Here's a representation using a glomerate model, and here it is liquid diffusion when your oxygen is dissolved in the ionomer. So 3 different stages having different characteristic diffusion lengths and different effective diffusion coefficients. So the question is, our low frequency loop diffusion impedance measures, which one is layer? That's linked to. And we try to analyze to answer to this question. So idea is to fit our curves with our TLM and Reynolds model, identify our diffusion parameters, so the diffusion resistance and the characteristic diffusion time. And what you see here, they are linked to the characteristic diffusion parameters. Means from our electrical components, you can directly obtain the characteristic diffusion length and the effective diffusion coefficient. Just note that here it's characteristic diffusion length and coefficient, meaning it takes into account the porosity and the torch porosity. Just keep this in mind without going into detail. Here we showed the different models we used so to interpret our spectra here. And solid lines are associated with the cathode side. So the question to ask is where, so it's the catalyst layer is at origin. Catalyst layer means the ionomer layer, and the catalyst layer is the GDM. The rounded circuit where the bar of diffusion impedance is connected directly in series to the charge transfer resistance implies that your diffusion impedance is linked to the catalyst layer. Means the ionomer layer or liquid diffusion in the ionomer layer or gaseous diffusion inside the pores of your catalyst layer. But if it would be GDL, it would be more physically more convenient to take the diffusion impedance outside the circuit of the oxygen reduction, the kinetics, put it in series. And in this case, so what we tested as well, and in this case, we tested as well an alternative to the Barber diffusion impedance, which was developed by Andrei Kulikowski, which took into account the impact of the reaction kinetics at the cathode on the oxygen diffusion through the GDO. It's physically okay, this is our circuit on the cathode side here, the high frequency resistance again for the representation to the membrane. And just note here is the dotted lines is the representation of the anode this time because we needed this for our spectrally analyzed. As oxygen diffusing very hydrogen diffusing very fast, we do not need a diffusion impedance. Okay, here you see the spectrum measured. Blue dots here is one of one of cells. Here you see the different fitting curves obtained with the different models. And this shows you what we have identical fitting curves. 3 different models, 3 different and identical fitting curves means you have to, this should be point again with CIS, have to, the conclusion or what helps is know which the most appropriate model is, what are the conclusions you obtain, what are the most reasonable conclusions you obtain. Okay, here just show you the different characteristic diffusion parameters identified with different models. Here, Warburg CCL, so Warburg impedance is inside the CC cathode circuit. Warburg GDL means if you took the Warburg impedance outside the cathode circuit, and here Kulikovsky GDL means if you use a Kulikovsky impedance instead of Warburg impedance. And what you see is in all 3 cases independently, your characteristic diffusion length and the effect is closer to the thickness of the GDL than to the thickness of the active layer, and much orders of magnitude higher than the ionomer layer covering the active sites is about the order of nanometers. And as well, the effective diffusion coefficient is close to gaseous oxygen diffusion. So means that conclusion is that it seems that the diffusion impedance here, so here, the diffusion impedance of our spectra is more probably linked to the GDL rather than to the electrodes. And in this case, this configuration here, putting the oxygen diffusion impedance outside the cathode reaction circuit, which would be more reasonable. And this was our conclusion for this. Published as well. And with this, I will stop on the low frequency interpretation causes. Low frequency interpretation is a little bit tricky because you have on the one hand some artifacts coming from the measurement signal, which are very important when you analyze local spectra. So what's shown here from colleagues at the PSI in Zurich that showed that and they compared here spectrum measured when applying the perturbation to the overall cell, and here a spectrum measured by applying port and current perturbation only to the last segment. Difference is that you have, if you apply current perturbation, current means if you have higher lower current means you have higher lower oxygen concentration, means you apply oxygen concentration perturbations, and if you have a linear cell, they will propagate along the cell and perturbate your signal, means creating artifacts. And so they're very tricky to separate what is an artifact and what is real physics of your cell. Another point is that the Warburg diffusion impedance assumes constant oxygen concentration along all the focal plates and is based on one-dimensional thickened pure diffusion instead of Stefan Maxwell equations. And as well, within our groups, I found improvements of the diffusion impedance, just to give you an example of what we did, we developed as well transport impedance that takes into account convection additional to diffusion by introducing convection velocity depending on a water transfer coefficient. If this water transfer coefficient is 0.5, means you have diffusion only. If it's 0, you have convection in the same direction as diffusion. So it means here's the simulated curve, the black curve. So you have lowering the transport impedance, and if you have transfer coefficient equal to 1, you will have convection in the opposite direction to diffusion, means you have a higher low frequency oxygen transport impedance. And this was confirmed by measurements. They were performed here by the framework of the PhD of Anthony Thomas, who should normally be, I guess, attending as well this presentation. He is now the researcher at Poitiers, the laboratory of Pellegrini. And all these results were done in the framework of our PhDs when we have been researchers. Deal of motivation. So it was just to give some memories again to our conjunct research. Okay, I will start now with the low frequency limit coming now, the PMHC aging application. And we speak a bit about aging. Aging of fuel cell components is primarily concerns the aging of your electrodes, and more precisely cathodes, and to a lower extent the anodes means carbon corrosion and platinum catalyst dissolution and residualization, which will result in a lowering of the thickness of the cathode primarily and a lower extent the anode, and the impact on your operation means you will have lower performance with time. Another component is the aging of the membrane due to chemical, mechanical, and thermal stresses. The tricky point is with membrane aging is you won't have any significant impact on your performance until you have pinhole and cracking happening, and this will, in the worst case, significant direct stop of your fuel cell. The aging of this material is the major barrier of the widespread deployment of PEM fuel cell, because they have insufficient lifetime in order to attempt the requirements put for time for 250 that's shown here. But I guess for transport applications, I guess everybody knows. Okay, so we do as well some research in the framework in order to identify different physical phenomena that are at the origin of aging of the electrodes and the membrane. If you would measure the evolution of our performances during normal operation, will be very expensive in time, mostly. Therefore, what is a convenient way to analyze aging is to use accelerated stress tests. Means you reproduce the stresses there are encountered during operation in a very accelerated procedure. Therefore, we developed for our research an accelerated stress test that would concern electrode aging and membrane aging. It consists of potential siphon. Potential siphon would primarily create electrodes aging during transits, primarily of the cathodes. Open circuit voltage operating. Open circuit operating would primarily induce chemical aging of the membrane, and humidity cycling And in our case, humidity cycling that was load induced, means by playing of the independent duration of high current and low current operation, which will induce more hydrated periods and dehydrated periods. And this will probably create mechanical stress of the membrane due to swelling and shrinkage to dehydration. So this procedure we apply is about one period is 105 seconds, and we apply this repetition of the cycle during 24 hours, and all the 24 hours we make all stage of characterizations of measuring current and given the voltage is given 0.5 amperes per centimeter squared, apply electrochemical impedance spectroscopy, measuring the polarization curve, measuring the permeation current, and as well making cyclic voltammetry to determine the electrochemical surface area, and as well to determine the anode and cathode potentials. And then once the characterization is done, again, we repeat our AST, and we'll do this during 10 days. And it will as well compare all our performances to a reference case is for fuel cell Tania that operates at permanent current 0.5 amps per centimeter squared. Okay. Here we see the first question is to answer what is the adapted circuit we use for our EIS analysis. So here we show a spectrum measured at the beginning of life, characterized by two loops and something that could be a 45-degree slope. So take one, say electrode, or a very small half loop, we don't know. It's the first thing we have to analyze. At the end of our ASC, we saw this is the appearance of an anode, means our AST induced aging of the anode. So it was a surprising contribution. So, okay, what we did is to answer the question of beginning of life is we tested a random circuit, interfacial electrode with an anode, and modified TMM, thick electrode for the WB2 with an anode. Here you see all the parameters identified with the configuration without the anode, so without the dotted lines, randomless and TMM circuit. You see we have different parameters, and here a contribution of ion conduction, so through the electrode cathode volumes of the electrode. Difficult to say which one to use. Random circuit did not yield really satisfying to quality for the 45-degree loop. And if you see here, if we connect additionally anode circuit, we obtain identical values for all parameters in common. A very low ion resistance means that seems that ion conduction to the electrode is negligible, means interfacial electrode, which would be in agreement with the fact that we use commercial very thin electrodes, and we succeeded as well in identifying identical anode parameters. Therefore, we concluded seems to be that the anodes must be taken into account. The TFM can be used as well instead of the randoms, as there's no additional information you could get for a need of simplicity of our this most possible use the randoms. Okay, here you see the parameters we identified during, so for EIS, we identified so for reaction kinetics of the anodes, cathode and the anode, in blue for our AST and in red for our constant current test. We see that in the case of our AST, our reaction kinetic parameters, both electrodes degraded, meaning we have aging on both electrodes. So we observed a decrease of the capacitance, the layer capacitance, so our electrodes with time are less able to store charges, and we have an increase of the charge transfer resistance, means lower reaction kinetics at both cathodes and anodes. This was the most surprising one. For the cathode, it was not really surprising, but an anode, it was very surprising. And almost no evolution for constant current operation. And this was when we looked for our other characterization techniques that I did not show the last time. So here we see what we observed for the self-performance measurements, means when we followed here the potential we measured on operation at 0.5 amps per 7 minutes. Squeeze again, blue IST, red for constant current operation. We see that we have almost no evolution of the voltage, constant current, whereas a decrease of the voltage during the AST. And as well, here you see our polarization versus time, constant current, almost no evolution, whereas for the AST degraded. Logic confirms CIS analysis. Here you see what we obtained, the evolution of the electrochemical surface area. So it is at the cathode and the anode will be an indicator for the state of health of your electrodes. If the electrochemical surface area goes down, means you lose active salts, can be carbon corrosion, platinum dissolution. What we see is that at the cathode, decrease during AST was logic because we did voltage cycling. Voltage cycling means you create subject your cathode to corrosion. So this is in the agreement what we observed in literature. Almost no evolution of the electrochemical surface area for the constant current test, but what you see as well, here is more surprising, we had as well a decrease of the anode electrochemical surface area this time, and much more important for the cathode. So that's here to say is all our different characterization techniques have the same, leads to the same conclusion. Now to see, we were what we interested was what are the physical explanation behind this, and therefore what we use is to follow our electrodes potentials that we measure thanks to our segmented cell and instrumented cell, thanks to our reference hydrogen electrodes. So here we see our local cathode potentials. So blue is the inlet of air, red is the outlet of air that we measured at the beginning of life at the cathode and at the end of life at the cathode. And what you see is that our electrode potentials at the cathode, they vary vertically between about 0.9 and 0.4 volt, which is directly the voltages they are subjected to carbon corrosion. So seems that and this confirms that the decrease of the performance and of the electrochemical surface area at the cathode seems to be linked to electrochemical mechanisms, means carbon corrosion, dissolution, and platinum dissolution. But when we look here for the anode potentials, beginning of life and end of life, so between the beginning of life and end of life, we observe small increase of the anode potentials, but always remain lower than 0.5 volt. So means there's no carbon corrosion. It's not possible. So the decrease we observed in the electrochemical surface area and in the performance could be linked to chemical degradation, perhaps, but not to corrosion. And this was confirmed as well by post-mortem analysis from our colleagues at FCLAB that analyzed our MIA that we use for our tests, crystalline MIA and H MIA, by transmission electron microscopy analysis here at the anode, the cathode, the amine, where we got small particles, so in light gray, it's the carbon particles, in black and dark gray, it's platinum, beginning of life, end of life, and we see clearly at the cathode, clear platinum particle agglomeration confirms that we have carbon corrosion and platinum accumulation dissolution or agglomeration. But if you look for the anode, it's almost no dissolution. So this confirms that electrochemical processes should not be at the origin of this degradation. And there we are. So we suppose it's more aging, mechanical, and chemical aging of the near that at the origin of this. These gray particles have already been there. Okay, so it means that all our different characterization techniques have the same, lead to the same conclusion, and we are able to show that the anode as well aged during the operation of the ST was very nice result. And for this, I come to the conclusion just in time. How to conclude all this 2 hours? I won't go into detail of the conclusion of our research application just for the application of EIS. So keep in mind, EIS is a common technique used to analyze performance and durability of electrochemical systems. If there are converters or storage devices, the main advantage of EIS is that you can analyze microscopic phenomena and identify and analyze microscopic phenomena occurring at different timescales separately, and in situ during operation. The electrical equivalent electric circuits are models that allow you to reproduce your experimental spectra of your electrochemical systems in a very comfortable way. However, for a reliable interpretation, you have to be sure that your parameters inside are related to microscopic phenomena at the origin of your electrical output. Means you have to know you have a physical and chemical vision of your system, and that your circuit as well has to be adapted to the operating conditions and of the materials used. Means there is in EIS something for everyone. People who love modeling, people who love analyzing, so people who love mechanics, physics. So it's a response to all what a researcher can dream about. And this, I think, has finished with my talk. Thank you for your attention. You can wake up.
Excuse me, I have a question about the aging.
Mhm.
I was going to ask the test that you've done.
Yeah.
It was for a constant current, so it's like you were studying the calendar aging of the fuel cell.
This was the reference case. The reference case where you apply constant current.
Yes. So
And this was just means constant current. We assume stationary operation, no aging or low aging. And our aging test actually consists of potential cycling current, current-induced potential cycling. Means we cycle between high current and low current operation corresponding to a voltage between 0.8 and 0.3 volt. And this is actually a fact that was shown in literature. That voltage and current is the transients actually that are at the origin of corrosion, carbon corrosion, so processes, so electrode aging. And as we did this very fast, means we accelerated our aging processes. Because
so it's not just the constant current, it's not just the degradation which is which which you obtain from the constant current solicitation, right? It's like there is also the degradation due to the dynamic.
Exactly. So our constant current here is just the reference case. The AST is this one here. So you have a period, we have majority, so we always switch between high current, low current, means low potential, high potential. We have a period where we have majority high current operation, means high current, a lot of water production. So we mean have good hydrated conditions. And then we have a period with mostly low current operation, means less water production, means dehydration periods. And then as well, finish by a sequence at OCD, which should, by applying, supplying hydrogen and oxygen, means we should induce chemical degradation of the membrane. And one sequence lasts 105 seconds, and at the end of the sequence, we start again, and we cycle again. And this is automatically done for 10 days. We have a really accelerated aging.
And were you able to add something to this modelization? Since in your modelization, we can identify each part of the fuel cell, because you've tried to modelize like a circuit of the anode, of the cathode. With the, on these circuits, is it possible to add something which can reflect the impact of this cycling aging?
Okay, what we analyze, just to be sure, because this one is done during 10 days. But all the 24 hours, this will induce stresses, create aging. All the 24 hours, we stop the cycle and we make a characterization set. I think we measure performances. And then we use actually our model here in order to interpret the spectra. So here I just show you the spectra measured at the beginning of life and end of life. And all the 24 hours, we will have one spectrum, and that we fit with our model. And our model will allow us to identify here what is the evolution of the high frequency resistance that's linked hydraulically to the membrane. So this allows us to have an information about the state of the membrane. We can identify here the double layer capacitance and charge transfer resistance at the cathode and the anode that was shown here. Will give us an information about the reaction kinetics will evolve, means if they will increase or decrease. Okay, so here just this one tells us there's something, we have slower reaction dynamics, slow performances of the reaction kinetics with time. More or less, just we have, seems that the electrodes are less performant to ensure the electrochemical reactions. We will as well identify the diffusion parameters, as we are still not really clear what is the physical meaning about this. I'll skip this at the moment. And to have more, here this electrochemical field spectroscopy for the moment just serves us to set it, okay, degrades. And then we have our other techniques that give us more insight on what happens, really happens. Here, just these here inform us as well, decrease of performance. Okay, decrease of performance, EIS tells us decrease of performance, yes, should lead to lowering, should lead to, yes, a degradation of the electrodes. Performance priority up. Okay, this one here confirms, yes, priority electrodes, reduction of the active area. And what tells us more about physical origin, if it would be electrochemical, so corrosion processes or others, these are the local potentials. So actually, the interpretation, there's all a different battery of tests joined together that can help us to interpret what will this cycle, our tests, induce.
For those tests, what happened at
120 hours.
Everything she did.
Okay, if there was one of my PhD present, because they insisted it's very interesting to show, it's very interesting to show. But we do not know. If you show the, yes, segmentation. No.
Type of test during the weekend?
No. Actually, we repeated it. Always saw it with repetition. So there should something happen. So we did it for different reasons. So, it's repeated.
Because you reverse completely the trend. It's really something big that's happening.
Yes, so you see it in all our characterizations. Repeatable. And we observed it again with different layers of the same furniture, so the same producer, and with different means as well, different producers.
Must be some threshold.
But so to see ourselves, this is all automatically.
There was also my question, maybe something that is similar to what you already asked. Are you sure, did you validate the AST itself? Are you sure with that profile that you are really reducing the degradation that we can face during operation?
Or it's still up. It's just we jump to this here. Actually, literature find different references make it for different kinds of AST that exist in the literature that identify for here you analyze this process, for example, open circuit voltage primarily linear, low potential cycling. It is primarily this will be corrosion. Actually, it's not the operation high current, low current, high potential, low current, low potential that will induce corrosion. These are transient.
Sometimes even the level of high and the level of low makes the total difference.
Exactly.
And this is the key points.
Mhm. So therefore, so here's just an output, the scope of what we analyzed in the literature, and based on this, we developed. We were interested in having, as we wanted to, and making aging the electrodes and the MIA. This was our hybrid test we developed based on this. High, so very high variations, 0.8 voltage of 0.8 volts, 0.3 was we confirmed from the literature was really in the scope of reducing cathode corrosion. It's not anode corrosion. Actually, it's very less to be found in the literature how to making aging the anode. Therefore, we're very surprised to finding that our anode was aging. And actually, here's just an outcome we as well had, because it was done in the framework of an RNA project in which we analyzed the propagation of defaults as well. So the impact of a default in your MIA in the aging. So we analyzed as well MIAs with a default inside leakage of active layer, how this will impact the aging as well the propagation. And we observed as well some propagation of our defaults along the 12 lead. Those are related to those we just have, and we're just trying to paper on the software to they've shown us that for sufficient time. We can have a more detailed discussion on this afterwards.
And from the literature that you've done, are you able to say, for example, that this profile is equivalent, so this is 120 hours profile, it is equivalent to a normal degradation of 1,200 or something like that. We multiply or we divided the time by 10 or something.
Okay. And this, as it was not the objective We did not went and make the comparison to how many times of operations.
It's not that easy.
It's not that easy, and the objective was we wanted to observe aging, because at the beginning, it was not so easy to creating sufficient aging during 10 days. So the objective was to have a very harsh profile, most harsh we can do, to make aging different components. It could be different things. We did not, it was not objective, we did not try to make the comparison.
So the thing that we can retain, c'est retenir, no? Yeah, the thing that we can retain from this work is that you have a way to modelize the system, and you identify with the electrochemical spectroscopy. You identify the real values of the parameters of your electrical circuit, and you just tune these parameters so your model can reproduce this data.
To be sure, we not tune the parameters, we identify the parameters, because all our modeling is used for interpretation. So, we're not doing simulations and making a preview what will happen, but our models are used to be able to interpret our measured data. So actually we will do some tests and measure. Then you have data. And then, or to say, okay, what our data will do to make speaking the data. So our modeling forces due to interpretation. So it's very identified parameters. So here we do not impose. This were not us who imposed, who say this parameter, that's the value, and then we see what value we have to use to fit with the data, but it's very fitting. So therefore, as well, our models have to be sufficiently simple so that the algorithms we use can identify. So another part of our work is to improve as well the algorithms for a reliable interpretation. It's really measured based on experimental data. And here and perhaps the lines you see, it's just linear interpretation is done for us. Okay, we suppose it's the dots are identified parameters that we identified by Slinkers and Chong fitting all our measured spectrum. From this measured spectrum, fit them, and we identify parameters, and identify parameters are these points. Here the lines are just a linear interpolation saying, okay, to have an idea on if it's aging, if it's not aging, supposing in 10 days more or less linear aging. It is linear.
So here we are representing 2 cycles. That means 2 days of testing. So
10 days.
The whole 10 days.
The whole 10 days. Here we see beginning and here every 24 hours, 24, I see 10 days.
So what happened to the stack after that? Are they completely died?
Right.
The stacks at the end, when you tested them? What happened?
We did our measuring, so we did our measuring only at the unit cell level. The cell is shown here. We had our colleagues from FCLAB did it on the cell level. On the stack level, sorry.
So were you able to run any other tests on this cell after this 10 days?
You mean to perform aging? Yes. We considered another presentation. I don't know if it's shown now or later. Okay, but yes, we just for some thing was 10 days for all our comparisons, but proportionate and actually we succeeded in making pinholes and having increase of the hydrogen permeation current, and yes. Exactly. If you want to get like it to
you had a picture of measurements per segment at the beginning, and the same topic we were discussing about, and
Which one, aging or?
yes, yeah. So there it's yeah, the different colors are the segments 1 to 20. And you see at the beginning there was something happening at the last segments. They were having a bit more voltage. But at the end that was like the first and the last show something strange.
Okay,
It's just the last segment.
here.
Yeah.
Okay.
So especially at the anode.
Okay, and you want to know why?
I was thinking, so there's something happening at the beginning and the end, and can this be extrapolated also to the first and last cell instead?
Okay, I would be very, I don't know if you can extrapolate to a stack. Because here, you used actually a linear cell. Linear cell is really, you rather use a linear cell inside the commercial PMC and so this was really to see why the linear cell, because it's more easy to control, to ensure homogeneity of temperature, working conditions, and you really know that you will potentially have high concentration at the inlet, low concentration at the outlet. And we, to say really what happens, and what we observed at the beginning of life, we had a very homogeneous current profile, and at the end of life, there was something happened, and the heterogeneous current profile is actually at the origin of the heterogeneous potentials or vice versa. So something happened. We didn't go into detail what happens inside this. We just here wanted to know if is there any potential that goes until potentials that were subjected to corrosion processes. This was not the case. But what, I guess you will respond to your second questions. I don't know if it's representative to us. Let me know how is the gas supply, for example, stack, could it be, it's a real question for you. Would it, because finally, these are individual cells separated electrically, and there's a, and the thing is, when you have a gas supply from one side and they go to all the others, could you, for you, would it be reasonable to consider to have individual cells, meaning you are the same here? Sorry, would it be reasonable to say your segmented cell corresponds to a stack?
Because in a stack, you have the dimension of the cells, and then you have the dimension between cells, not cells. And it will depend if you have a overflow or counterflow. So you have more consideration to take into account. You don't have the same distribution, so it's very complicated. But at least you can try to extrapolate it to different cells inside the stack. And even that with a lot of precautions.
And the other thing, I just a question very interesting because I'm really wondering, perhaps it's a very naive question. Imagine you have a medium, you make on one membrane really separated, or you make on in the cell individual mediums. Could this be represented? A small stack in one cell? I never thought about this. Imagine if you make a media yourself and a linear cell. perhaps. Would be an easy way to analyze, perhaps it would be interesting perhaps to try to compare what we measured in a study very recently.
Are there some questions online? We're discussing here in the room. So if you're online and you have a question, either you can just open your mic. It works quite well. We hear you quite well, or you just type it in the chat. While you're thinking about your, okay. Anthony Thomas wants to ask a question.
Yes, thanks a lot, Julia, for the great presentation. I have a question about, did you already apply your transmission line model on batteries, lithium batteries or some batteries? Because if you want to see some effect of diffusion of lithium due to defect on your electrode or your SEE, it can be useful to use it too.
Actually, thanks for your nice question. Actually, that's the reason why I'm here. Because up to now, we never ever applied our EIS analysis on batteries. This was really I was looking for opportunity to have an application to batteries. The only thing that was the most closest to batteries are these supercapacitors and these hybrid supercapacitors, which have actually additional ion intercalation, charge storage. So there should be some impact of ion diffusion. And it would be very interesting to see if the ion diffusion could be due to, first of all, would be this water element here, should be linked to ion diffusion inside the different pore space for lithium ion intercalation. So potentially is this element could give some information about this. And why I'm thinking that such kind of supercapacitor model could potentially help for analyzing or useful for batteries is when I saw the presentation that Daniela gave during the summer school of your EIS spectrum measured on batteries. Actually, they're very similar to these fiber supercapacitors. Doesn't mean it's possible, potentially. And it's exactly the question you asked, Anthony, that I'm asking myself. Perhaps I can answer to this in some time.
Okay, Julia, so if you need some impedance spectroscopy in batteries, we can give you. It's okay, and we can exchange on supercapacitor too.
Ah, ça se met pas tomber dans l'oreille. Okay, great. With pleasure, I propose we keep in contact afterwards and we'll see what we can do on this.
Sure.
Great.
So as long as online you think about questions, you talk very little about temperature and the influence of temperature in behavior and aging, and also the parameters of systems vary a lot with temperature.
It's easy because we did all our possible to impose constant temperature. So we did not analyze this influence. So we put ourselves on, here was always our PMC analysis were 80 degrees. So for aging or 70 degrees, 80 degrees. So for the aging analysis for 80 degrees, because as well this was mentioned in the AST, if you want to have accelerated stress about cycling at 80 degrees. So all our analysis were rated at a constant post temperature. So but actually it is possible. It's easy to measure different and compare different spectra, measure different temperature.
Any other question? Everyone is hungry? So for those who are online, we are going to do a picnic here after the presentation.
So thanks for attending. Be comfortable partner. Okay. So thanks for attending online. If you have some other questions afterwards, or Daniela can transmit them, or you send me an email. I guess you have my email address.
Yes. As everything, I will put the link.
Yes, feel free, will be a pleasure. Okay. Thanks a lot. She said.